Hello and welcome to WNHH FM's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make New Haven tick. Rosa DeLauro is always in the headlines in New Haven. She's been making New Haven tick and representing us in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1991. Now she's running for her 15th two-year term, and she has stopped by WNHH studio to tell us about it. And thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. Rosa DeLauro, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. It's terrific to be with you, my friend.
I wonder if it's mathematically possible for you to figure out how many times you've been interviewed over the last 30 years.
I can't. Maybe you can keep track of that.
I've had the pleasure of following your entire
right. No,
congressional
you
career.
did one of the
original
the first
story.
stories. Yeah. Very,
so how you
very
doing?
first story. I'm doing well.
You know, we'll get into the campaign, but
Right.
you were at something the night, which wasn't really a campaign event. You were at the Jewish Community Center in
Right.
Woodbridge, and what a night! You know, after that horrible massacre in the Pittsburgh shul, you and a lot of people, 800 people, showed up to have a vigil for the victims and for the Jewish community come together and get support from others. And it was an interesting night because they didn't have elected officials talk or candidates, but you sat up front to offer support, and there was something below the surface. People didn't want to make it too quote unquote political. So no one stood up and said, you know, they didn't mention the name Donald Trump. There was one talk by the wonderful Rona Shapiro, the rabbi of Woodbridge, about gun control and voting, not for whom. But there was this undercurrent of a majority of the Jewish community votes Democratic, feels that Donald Trump is sowing hatred that's allowed a lot of anti-Semitism and much other kinds of bigotry, not just anti-Semitism, to come to the fore, and is responsible to some extent for hate coming out of the closet and all this violence. Other people, there were Republican elected officials in that room who are also showing their support for the Jewish victims who support Donald Trump. Do you think it's fair to talk about what happened in Pittsburgh, what's happening in our country with hate and violence? Is it fair to put it at Donald Trump's or the Republicans' doorstep?
Let me just step back from your comments for a moment. I think it was so appropriate in the way that the Jewish Community Center, the vigil, and there were hundreds of people, as you've said, and people from all walks of life. This is not a political gathering, and I think they made such sense to bring together people of faith, healers, people whose role and whose mission is to bring people together to create unity out of division and differences. And I thought that was very, very poignant. And it gave me a sense of real strength of where our community needs to go, because this is not a political issue.
I felt that way too.
Really. And you know, I spoke to my colleague Mike Doyle yesterday, and it's his district, Squirrel Hill. And he said there were 5,000 people at a vigil, and it is all about unity and showing support for the families. But, you know, every one of us, and I suppose there's more of an onus on people who are elected officials or people who ascribe to wanting to be an elected official, that the words we utter, the words we speak, the comments that we make have consequences. And I have, for the last a few weeks, and you haven't been with me as I go around and speaking these days, Paul, but what I have been saying is that you cannot create an environment of division and of hate and of name calling and singling out individuals or groups for a commentary or derision or you know, any other ill-meaning, you know, commentary. You can disagree with people, but what we're not and should not be doing is creating this environment of hate.
Did Donald Trump
division.
create this environment?
I believe that he is responsible for creating hate speak, and that is a genie that you cannot put back in the bottle. Now, he's not, you know, alone in this effort, but he has, if you take a look at the incidents over the last few days, the bombs and the gentleman who has, if you take a look at the van of Cesar Sayoc and the individuals that Donald Trump has highlighted and who
That was
has
the hit list.
denigrated
It was the hit
the
list.
hit list,
Yeah.
exactly. Those were the paper coverings of his van. So that, in fact, in that instance, we have seen something that was a direct, relationship between what is being said and an action. And then we take a look at the slaughter in Pittsburgh, and we listen to words like invasion, and we listen,
Right, because
to
the guy said he was partly motivated by the Jewish group that supports
refugees and this invasion and invaders, etc. The language is similar, so therefore there is a direct relationship.
Do you tie it also to when the president has called on his crowd to commit violence at times at rallies?
Yes, yeah, we yes. You can't, the way I've described democracy in my comments to people today is you can't body slam democracy. You can't keep hitting against the rule of law. You can't be name calling, creating division, an environment of hate. That our democracy is precious, and we need to nurture it. And it is, unfortunately, I don't believe our president is nurturing democracy.
Does he have blood on his hands this week?
Look, he is not responsible for the actions, and someone else carried out that action. But I think he is responsible for the climate in which these kinds of hate actions can occur.
Julia Gambala Guj, and I'm so sorry I know I'm mispronouncing your name, post on Facebook. I just want to thank our Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro for constantly and consistently having the backs of every citizen of our refugees, our asylum seekers, of the vulnerable. May we all learn from her years of service in these times, especially where we see the perpetuation and nod toward hate of those some consider, quote, others. Kate Rosen writes in, thank you, Congressman DeLauro, for all that you do for our state. Are there any local races, candidates you are especially excited for? So I'm guessing, and thank you for the comments, folks. I'm guessing Kate is involved in one particular one. Would any of you want to mention?
Well, first of all, I've spent a lot of time. I'm very focused on the State House.
That can go either way.
It is.
It's interesting about Connecticut because,
races.
you guys are, you folks are running for congressional offices where the Republicans really aren't contesting them. I know you're not supposed to say that or think that because you don't take anything for granted. But the rest of us can look at it and say, gee, they're not even putting money into the race. But at the state level,
yes.
This governor race can go absolutely either way. I don't know about the down ticket races enough, but I know that the state house, the state senate are really considered. Also, they could go either way.
I have, I went to assist out of state to a colleague of mine in Pennsylvania. But other than that, and I've said that what I wanted to do was to spend time with our state Senate candidates, our state representative
candidates. Any in particular, Kate Rosen was saying, any particularly got your eye on?
Well, look, I'm in this area. We have James Maroney, we have Matt Lesser, we have Liz Lenahan, we have Cynthia Cohen's, Cindy Boynton. And I've walked with I've been walking, door knocking with all of these candidates.
And I know you're supporting all the candidates. I've read the articles in the Valley Independent Sentinel.
Right.
You
Cara
did not,
Rochelle.
Yeah, I was going to say, until that, you didn't mention the two races in our region that some people think might determine whether Democrats I know you're supporting the candidates, whether Democrats or Republicans are going to run either house. And that is the state Senate race with the first-term incumbent Republican George Logan versus George Cabrera. So I know I'm saying that's the one, and that's an interesting
race. I've been with George.
It's almost like a microcosm of your congressional district in that you have Ansonia, kind of blue collar. You have Woodbridge, wealthy. You have Hamden, which is a little bit of both.
I was in Naugatuck on Saturday with George.
And then you mentioned Cara Rochelle. It's also
Cara Rochelle. I have focused my time and attention. If all the names are not coming to me, but and I'm going to walk with Mary Abrams.
Why is it so
later
close?
Today?
If you are able to be there for 30 years and not have a serious opponent, and everyone else in our delegation in Connecticut can be Democrats and secure seats, we even have an open seat where they're not that seriously contesting it. Why is it so? Why are we such a purple state in Hartford?
Well, look, I think that people are feeling the financial pinch of the state, the concerns around that issue. They're also. I go back to what I believe is the biggest issue that we face, and that's here in Connecticut as well as around the country, Paul, and that is that people are in jobs that just don't pay them enough money. Families are struggling today.
And why are they going from that? Or are they just looking for something?
Well, they're looking. They want to know who is going to help to make a difference in their lives. And our job, and I view this as my job, is you have to walk in people's shoes. You have to understand. And it's important because the struggle is about, this is what I hear, increased costs of health care, education.
Oh, that's a killing. The healthcare thing is out of control.
The families can't get their kids to school. Student debt, is a big issue.
So are they looking for both parties there because they feel at the state? Because at the federal level, they're not blaming the Democrats in Connecticut. We're blue. But at the state level, we're very purple.
Well, I think that has to do with the financial situation of the state and the difficulty surrounding that and the back and forth in the legislature because of the deficit. And people are concerned as to the impact on their lives and the impact on the services, because services have been cut due to the
and there's that whole dilemma. You deal
problem.
obviously with this closely every day. People don't want to pay taxes and they don't want services cut. So how do you deal with that dilemma?
Well, that is always a dilemma. But you have to demonstrate to people that what is the money being used for? How is it going to help me and my family? And that is the issue. People talk to me about how can you help me? That is what this race is about.
What do the Democrats need to be doing in order to answer that question in a way that will get people to vote Democratic?
Well, I think, Democrats are doing, look, I've said for a long time that I think Democrats have to reconnect with middle-class families, with working families, and I think that they are doing that. They have to understand the financial insecurity, the economic insecurity that families are facing. They are, how we talked about prescription drugs. We've talked about the cost of health care. How are we going to address that problem? What are we going to do about jobs and wages? How are we going to help to create jobs, increase that opportunity in this state?
So if experienced Rosa DeLauro were in the shoes of some of these first or second time candidates running for state office, what would be the 5 bullet points with specifics that you would answer to the voter on the doors in these local districts? Would you say minimum wage of $15? Would you say trade deals? Would you say what Trump is saying about allow us to base prescription drug prices on what they're sold for abroad?
This is what I always start with, the economic insecurity that people are facing, and that we have to address how we deal with that. One is, yes, the high cost of health care, the high cost of prescription drugs. We need to deal with the work-family issues.
Well, but how would you do on the prescription drugs? I'm wondering what are like the bullet point programmatic fixes that Democrats stand
for instance, we ought to be, federal government ought to be able to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. That was, years ago with Part D of Medicare, which I voted against because they prohibited the lobbyists, the special interests, prohibited they got to members of Congress and they prohibited the federal government from negotiating price. We ought to be able to negotiate price. It can't be willy-nilly. I've introduced something called a review board. So if you, pharmaceutical company, want to increase the cost of a particular drug, you have to come and tell us why that you want to do that. I have been long time a supporter of the reimportation of drugs that are FDA approved, so that we get the same advantage of people in Europe and Canada have in terms of the cost of drugs. There's a number of ways in which to address this issue, which we haven't done. Minimum wage
a good issue, because that's one where
minimum wage is a very, very good issue. Minimum wage, yes. Minimum wage is equal pay for equal work. We have to have paid sick. The state of Connecticut has paid sick days. We've led the nation on that. We need to have paid family and medical leave.
Okay, there we go. And then Chaudhry says, "Great lady." Zachary Santos Ladano is criticizing your term, but Zachary, we're not going to be reading personal or nasty language on the air here on Dateline. But we do welcome critical views, opposing views, and questions, and we're doing that on Dateline New Haven, on WNHH FM, your home for community radio at 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. We are talking today to Rosa DeLauro, who's running for a 30th year, or a 15th two-year term. That's a long time. How's it been? How's it gone over the years, 30 years in the Congress?
I am really, I am blessed. This is, people have often asked me, has this job met your expectations? This job exceeds my expectations, not for me having this job personally, but for what the potential of it. And that's what the Congress is about, Paul. The strength of the Congress is its potential and its ability to make a difference in people's lives, to create opportunity. And that's the way I look at this. If you take a look historically at what the Congress has done, you're looking at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment benefits, civil rights for people, the ability of working families.
So you don't
to
see
be
government
able
as
to
the
get their
problem?
cares.
You
No,
see the
I do
government
not see the
So in the
government as a
30
problem.
years you've been in, from the end of the Reagan Bush 1 era through the first Iraq war, through the Clinton era, through the Obama era, how has politics evolved in your 30 years in Congress, and how has being a congresswoman evolved?
Mm-hmm.
How has the job
Well,
evolved?
the politics, and I think this is nothing new to people. I mean, when I was first elected, there was at least in the first 3 or 4 years, there was great bipartisan efforts in terms of being able to craft public policy that met the needs of the country. That changed with the Gingrich Revolution.
And bipartisan doesn't mean middle. So you had John McCain and Orrin Hatch often making legislation with Ted Kennedy. It wasn't the people in the center. It was people who were out front for ideas they believed in and then found ways to compromise.
To get their way. And if I can just, and this is not, I don't mean to be self-serving. I wrote a book last year, which you know about it, The Least Among Us, Waging the Battle for the Vulnerable. And what it's essentially about was the social safety net. And again, which is a reflection of the values of this country, is that when people are in difficult times, government can play a role. What I found in the research on the book was that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the refundable tax credits, food stamps, all of these areas, minimum wage, etc., were crafted by Democrats and Republicans. When you people came from different philosophical points of view, but when there was an issue, a problem, a challenge in the country, that in fact they put the country's interest ahead of personal politics.
So you're mentioning like health care.
I'm talking about McGovern and Dole. I'm talking about Javits and housing. You're talking about even, Gingrich talked about a child tax credit, Leahy child tax credit, Ronald Reagan with an earned income tax credit.
So how do you do your job differently now that bipartisan and civility are out the window?
Well, it's out the window, but let me just reflect a little bit on the most recent experience for me with the appropriations bill, the Labor, Health, Education, and Human Services Appropriations Bill, which we passed just before we left. And it was in my view, two Democrats from the House, two Democrats, House and Senate, two Republicans, House and Senate, who came together around a bill and crafted a very, very good piece of legislation where we were able to increase funding for the National Institutes of Health. We increased mental health services. We increased, there was a plan to cut back on the low-income energy assistance program. We were able to increase that. Meals on Wheels got additional funding. We prevented people from defunding Planned Parenthood. I could go down chapter and verse over and over again. We increased money for state opioid grants, $1.5 billion.
So you're saying it's still possible?
I am saying it is possible. And when I think about this, Paul, I think about what we can get done in the minority. And then I think about how much more we can get done in the majority.
And that's possible.
That's possible.
Wendy Tyson Wood says, thank you, Congresswoman, for keeping working families and middle-class values alive. And Davis Jabbar Burnell says, time for change.
Okay.
And what about this caravan? I mean, in some ways, I feel like we shouldn't just talk about in the Times today about whether we should be talking about the caravan. So it's, just to be biased, there was a push to make this a central issue the week before the campaign so that we would be talking about this and not about the shootings or the pipe bombs or about health care.
Right.
What do you think about the decision to send troops to the border to stop this caravan? And if you don't agree with it, what should be done, if anything?
No, I do not agree with it. I think it is really is putting our men and women in armed services at great risk. And this is just about politics. This is about an election that is a week from today. The folks are miles and miles and miles and miles away from the U.S. border. They're talking about troops who are going to be facing nothing. This is just politics at its worst.
Are you concerned
to
about
scare
the caravan?
people? To scare people about people who are seeking refuge from violence and from rape and etc. Now, what I say is because you asked a very important question. What do you do? We need to address comprehensive immigration reform.
What would it look like?
And well, it would look like is what the Senate did all those years ago. Democrats and Republicans came together in the Senate. They talked about border security. They talked about a pathway to citizenship. They talked about ways in which you could eventually get to citizenship. And keep in mind that we have a policy that says you can seek asylum in the United States, and there is a process, and you have to be vetted. So
is the caravan breaking the law, coming seeking asylum?
No, they are not breaking any laws.
Do they present any threats?
They do not present any threats, except they present what has been created by this administration in creating the specter of a threat in the minds of people so that they will go out and vote against Democrats. That is what the president's motive is here. And you're listening to I know you've listened to the talk about bringing in smallpox, which was dealt with in the in 1980. They claimed an end to this, but they are just trying to scare people and to go out and to vote against Democrats. That is what this is all about, and it's wrong, and it's hateful, and it, in fact, incites violence.
All right, and then you do have an opponent, Rosa DeLauro, who's a supporter of the NRA, National Rifle Association. He believes that gun control leads to more violence. People need to be armed. That if you look at these shootings in the synagogues and schools, people should just have the teachers armed, the rabbis, or whoever else armed. What's your view on that? Does gun control work? Do we need more? And if so, what specifically?
Well, what we need to be doing is to have, in my view, I've spoken out on this for a very long time. We need to have a gun, laws that prevent violence, and that includes a number of things. It includes background checks. It includes this, if you're on a no-fly list, that you should not be able to access arms. I'm of the view, and I've been very straightforward on this, Paul. I think we need to ban assault weapons. I think we need to ban high-capacity magazines, and that we ought to, yes, provide the mental health services that are necessary to address.
Control? People have talked about bullet control because there's so many guns. I think that's just way out of the discussion right now.
Yeah, it is. I haven't been engaged in a discussion about that, but we have many ways in which to deal with these issues. And what has been so reassuring is the youngsters from Parkland who have gone all over the country and have talked about remarkable kids. And they come out of public schools, which is really terrific. But I've said to my colleagues, we either follow them or get out of their way. They are helping to lead the way in terms of a gun.
Harry writes in, so does she want open borders? Should we change the asylum laws so they don't get taken advantage of? What is her stance on the border? Well,
I think we do have, asylum laws, and one can take a look at them, but there is a process in place. I don't know that people understand this. People get vetted. There is a hearing. And if there is a case for what they call a, quote, credible fear, then that is a legitimate reason for asylum.
I will tell you that
most of the cases, people are returned to their country.
And so you feel it's not being taken advantage of?
So I do believe we need to make sure that we have immigration laws, as I said before, that deal with border security. And I went to the border. I've been to the border several times. I don't know if people know this, but one of the things we don't have is sophisticated equipment. Their computers go down regularly. We ought to be investing in,
So
new
you're not
technology.
for open borders. Some activists in New Haven are for open borders and abolishing ICE.
No, I think it's not about, I think it's about the policy. The policy of zero tolerance did not come from ICE. The policy came from the administration, where they were separating families at the border. And again, I went to the border. I watched the mothers and the children in cages, etc.
So you don't agree with separating families?
So I do not agree with separating. Families.
All right, you listen to Rosa DeLauro on WNHH FM 103.5, your home for community radio, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Big year for women. You've always been outspoken. You want to see more women in politics. In fact, that's what you did before you were Congresswoman at Emily's List. A lot of women running this year, I believe a record number.
Yes.
A lot of them are in some tough races. Mm-hmm. Is this going to make a difference? And are we going to see a lot more women in Congress? Is this going to be like after the Clarence Thomas hearings and there actually fundamentally changes how we legislate in this country?
Yeah, I think there are going to be a number of women who are elected. And it's not about the numbers, and I've always said this. It is about the agenda and the difference it makes in an agenda. And let me just give you a couple of examples. When I first went to the Congress, women and minorities were not included in the clinical trials at the National Institutes of Health. It was, when I got there, I was part of, yes. This is just, not
so
30 years ago.
Maybe a woman who could you were able to see it that way.
So, and what we did, and it was people, again, bipartisan. It was people like Anita Lowy, Nancy Pelosi, myself, Pat Schroeder, Marge Rockema, Republican from New Jersey, Nancy Johnson here. The group that came together and fought to be able to get women and minorities as part of the clinical trials at the National Institutes of Health, which they are today, and also to create the offices of women's health at the Department of Health and Human Services and at the Department of Labor. I want to give you another example, several examples, the changing nature of the debate and dialogue. We are, as part of our public discourse today, we're talking about equal pay for equal work, men and women in the same job getting the same pay, paid sick days. We're talking about paid family and medical leave. We are talking about an increase in minimum wage because 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. These were issues that were in the past, the recent past, that were on the sidelines. They were at the fringe. They are now part of the public discourse. Child tax credits, where you get a Marco Rubio talking about a child tax credit. These were thought to be, quote, women's issues. These are family issues. And women, as a part of that public discourse and in elected office, have changed the agenda for the better for families in this country.
Now, you and Nancy Pelosi have been decades in the trenches together.
Right.
You accomplished a lot of what you're talking about. She's now a punching bag. She is now held up by the Republicans as sort of a way to motivate the base. And younger Democrats looking for generational change are calling for her to be removed. Where do you stand on the next either majority, the House Speaker or majority?
I support Nancy Pelosi. I will support her as a Speaker of the House. I've worked with her over the years. I watched her turn this country around in terms of an economic recovery. I watched, if it were not for Nancy Pelosi, we would not have had the Affordable Care Act, and millions of people today would be without health care coverage. And in terms of a new generation, you watch TV in the same way that I do. I don't know if you've seen the faces on TV these days.
I actually don't watch TV.
You see, well, maybe you don't, but
I
others do.
haven't watched it since the first term yet.
Oh my gosh! You've got Jim Himes, you've got Debbie Dingell, you've got Hakeem Jeffries, Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, Jackie Spear. You've got a panoply of young leaders who are the spokespeople for the Democratic Party today.
The one I'm most interested in is Schiff. If you guys do win majority, him running the Intelligence Committee really will be a game changer. We have a few more comments here. Julia Gambella Gals and Harry are going back and forth on immigration. Harry says 80% of asylum seekers don't show up for court cases. Should we continue to practice catch and release? Julia responds, the law is to actually stand at the border, cross over at any point. It does not even have to be a designated point of entry. Read the law and read some books. Okay. Up to 90% actually do show up for court.
They do, and there was a program, by the way, that people are not familiar with. It was called the Case Management Program. It was instituted in 2016, and what they did was they had case managers around each of these cases, and they placed people with families, and 99% of the individuals showed up for the hearings. Trump administration, the program was ended. We have asked for the restoration of that case management system because it worked. And I've talked to Secretary Azar about it. And I said, can we do this?
And Aaron Schrag writes, so proud to have her as my congresswoman. She is someone who has been and will continue to be the people's champion in Washington. Thank you, Rosa. Obamacare, otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act. I guess in Kentucky, the Affordable Care Act is popular and Obamacare is unpopular. As I'm told.
Yeah.
What next? So this is a big issue.
Yes,
you and your opponent, Democrats' problems, if you're elected and who's in charge of the House. Some have called for repeal of Obamacare. Some have called for changing Obamacare. Some have just called hold the line. And now Democrats have found that they can run on it in purple states and gain traction. What should specifically happen with the Affordable Care Act in the next term, and what should not happen?
Well, first of all, the Affordable Care Act was a game changer for people. Millions of people had health insurance that they could afford for the first time. And those people like myself with pre-existing condition could be able to afford to get health care. And it's very interesting to note, Paul, that the Republicans were unable to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act legislatively. So what are they doing now? They are coming around through the appropriations process to try to dismantle it. And just a note, I am the ranking member of the Committee of Labor, Health, Education, Human Services. That is the program through which the funds for the Affordable Care Act flow through, and they are trying to cut off those funds. Now, what we ought to be doing, what my goal is to look at how we get to universal care, and that means looking at how we enroll people in health care, potentially from birth. There are a lot of options out there in which we can do this. I think that's where the discussion of where the Affordable Care Act ought to go.
Medicare to 50 years old?
Well, we ought to take a look at increasing the services on Medicare. Today, you don't get dental, you don't get hearing, you don't get vision. How do you divorce, your head, your teeth, etc., from being able to get access to the coverage? So we ought to increase those efforts. As I say, we ought to start from birth and something called auto enrollment. We ought to be able to say to employers, if you want to continue to provide insurance, you can do that, but make options available. The goal is universal care, in my view. That's where we need to take the Affordable Care Act.
And no cutbacks in ACA and fully fund it and not change the pre-existing conditions.
That's right. Well, you know what they've done.
What about low-cost health plans? There are two very views on that.
No, low-cost health care, that is no coverage. And again, you know the administration is in the courts today to do away with the ACA, and that includes pre-existing condition.
Right.
Okay? There are 130 million people in this country. That is outrageous. And that's why in this election you are finding, I don't know, the recent articles that I've seen that are talking about that health care has become a big issue, and the Affordable Care Act has had more support now than it has ever had.
Yeah.
And that's because people are realizing the benefits of the Affordable Care Act.
And then a couple issues where I think you and the companies like your opponent differ might be heading to the Supreme Court rather than Congress, unless there are ways that Congress can weigh in legislatively. I'm talking about LGBTQ rights, transgender rights, and that's the executive action right now with defining people as one gender based on the designated birth, abortion power, abortion rights, consumer power, union rights. Are those fights going to bypass you in Congress? Is it really going to be up to the Supreme Court in executive action?
Well, I think we have to, look, a lot depends on who's in charge.
States too.
Look, we get to, I believe we will take control of the House of Representatives, next week. I think the Senate is less likely, but I think that we have to be a bulwark against them doing what it is that they would like to do, or what they've been trying to do for years. And we cannot allow discrimination. We can't discriminate against LGBT.
Rosa, DeLauro, you co-chair the Congressional Food Safety
Yes.
Caucus. One of your big issues has been food safety and foodborne illnesses. You wrote the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2011, which includes regular inspections of high-risk foods facilities, requiring food companies to take preventative measures. You're trying to ensure that the rules are being enforced. What is the big challenge now with food safety now that you got that law passed?
Well, that is it's carrying out the law. I still want to continue to proceed, and I will introduce, along with my colleague on the Senate side, Senator Durbin, we probably will do it before the end of the year, is a single food agency. I still believe that that's the way to address this problem. We have
What
50,
would you combine?
well, we have 15.
Agriculture.
We have 15 agencies today that deal with some piece of food safety. Primarily, that's the Department of Agriculture, and it is the Food and Drug Administration. That has the bulk of the jurisdiction, and we would combine those 15 agencies and have a single agency. You know, today there is no single person in charge if there is a food outbreak that is salmonella or deaths recurring from that or any of that. We have little oversight of the volume of food that is coming from overseas. Our inspection rate is less than 1%. And so we need a central agency.
Do we have central oversight for other kinds of threats like to nuclear and other energy facilities? Because I know that daily in Connecticut there are many attempts to hack into the computer systems at our energy facilities.
Yeah. Well, we do have the Nuclear Regulatory Agency. We have a National Transportation Agency that deals with all of the transportation issues. We do have a central places where there is accountability.
Are we protected from foreign hacking? That would
this is an area that is of a real, concern these days. We are probably, and I'm really, in all fairness, I'm not an expert in these issues, and I've
always wondered why we're not going to microgrids.
Listen to others on this. That I think we have a lot of work to do in this area in order to be safer and more secure.
Hey, Jen B writes in, Rosa has been speaking truth to power for over a decade. Even in election years, she's a warrior and a shero. Rosa has been warning us about ours stripping Medicaid and Medicare for at least 2 years, probably much longer, but this is when I remember her raising the alarm loudly at a town hall. I am incredibly proud to have her as a congresswoman.
Thank you.
Your opponent, Mr. Cadena, supports a bridge over Long Island Sound from I-91 to Long Island. He said you have to update studies we've done in the 50s. He would couple this plan with studying construction of a futuristic Hyperloop corridor from Boston to D.C., which would accommodate speeds of up to 750 miles per hour. That would take money, unless you do it privately. What do you think of the idea?
Oh, look, I think it was in 1994 that I introduced the National Infrastructure Bank, which is and I reintroduced it again, including this year, and we're now talking about infrastructure writ large. And this is about not only roads and bridges, but it's about ports and environmental infrastructure, energy infrastructure, microgrids, a green bank, and it is public-private partnership, which would function in a similar way to what we have in Europe, which is the European Investment Bank, which helps to fund through public and private funding projects that are of, if you will, national significance. But it could be a region coming together. It can be states coming together. It can be a municipality where we can focus on rebuilding America. So I am a strong supporter of infrastructure efforts. I believe there needs to be a substantial public investment in this, as well as a private investment.
You like his idea about the bridge?
Well, I would take a look at that. I'm open to infrastructure projects because they produce jobs. I believe it's a real serious economic driver, and these are jobs that can't be outsourced. They can't be outsourced
yet.
No.
Okay. Election night 2016. It was kind of a poignant moment. You were at the Schubert from 8:15 to around 9:15, holding your event, and I was here editing, watching the returns, and I was communicating with my reporter there. I said, what did Rosa say about the next term? And she just said she can't wait to work with President Clinton in the White House. While you were talking,
Yeah.
this infamous dial on the New York Times site had this by the second was readjusting the probability of a Hillary
Right.
victory. When you began your speech, Hillary was still at about 99% probability of winning. Before you left that room and plugged back in to the internet, it was down to like 30% in an hour. It was happening so fast. What does that tell us of our ability now to read the electorate, to poll, to make predictions about elections?
Well, look.
And why do we get it so wrong?
Look, lots of things went wrong with that campaign, and I recall because I left there and went to my home where there were a number of people gathered, and the mood began to was people began just leaving because they couldn't deal with what was going to be the inevitable. Look, I think you take the temperature of people and you take a look at what is happening. We have bellwethers. We have looking today at what could the future be. I believe we will take the House back. As I say, there were a number of things at play in the 2016 campaign that were not calculated in, and I've said this publicly in the past. And I was a strong supporter of Hillary Clinton, but not going to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, I think, was a mistake. I think of not that reconnecting that what I've always been talking about, and I talked about it back then, that reconnecting with working families and understanding the lives that they lead was not what it should have been. And I think that Donald Trump was able to take advantage of that. But to date, he really has betrayed the promises that he made.
Hillary Clinton said she might want to
families.
run again next year in 2 years. What do you think?
I don't think she will.
Do you have a candidate you like?
I think there are a number of folks who are out there. I think we'll wait to see what happens. I want to get through the midterm elections.
We don't have to talk about 2020
We don't
yet.
have to talk about 2020
Okay, so
please.
14 terms. Can you think of a moment in this past term when you said, this is why I still do it?
There's so much at stake, Paul. And I really...
I heard you say, we always tell you this is the most important election ever, but this one really is.
Well, that's right. And you can go to any town committee, you can go to any candidate, and they will say the same thing. I really truly believe that what this election is about is the soul of our country. I said it before Joe Biden, who I love, but I said it before. I've been saying it for a very long time. We are a nation of values. We prize the rule of law. We prize a free press. I don't always like what the press says about me, but I stand strong for a free press. I said earlier in this conversation that democracy is fragile. You cannot body slam it. You can't hit it and expect it to survive. And I'm now also saying it's not about Democrats. It's not about Republicans on November 6th. This is about our government. It's about our country and the kind of place that we want to live in and raise our families in. That is what is at stake. It is the soul of this great nation.
I had more questions, but I kind of like ending on that. Eric Russell says, thank you, Rosa DeLauro. Has always been a strong, relentless voice for working and middle-class families in this country. I'm especially thankful for your passion and diligence in fighting against Betsy DeVos and proposed cuts in education. Keep up the fight. Rosa DeLauro, thank you. How many more terms do you think you'd want to run for?
I don't know. I'm taking it one at a time. I know I want this term. I want to go back, and I want to go back in the majority. That's what I want to do.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot,
much
Paul.
for joining us, everyone, on WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. Thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.